Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to your online classes in evolutionary biology. I am Dr. Faiza Abbasi. I am a wildlife scientist and I have specialized in the study of sympatric species, ecological isolation, which is a topic with evolutionary significance. At the Aligarh Muslim University, I work at the UGC HRD Center as its assistant director. I teach papers related to wildlife sciences, and I will be taking these last two units in your paper on evolutionary biology. So, first of all, I must congratulate you. You have all opted for this very interesting stream of biology as part of your BSc honors under the CBCS system. Now, in your case, it happens to be a discipline centered elective of evolutionary biology. In other universities, according to the UGC, there are this paper is also offered as a core course, and in that case, yeah, as you can see, the syllabus is very extensive. You have just 4 units, but then they have these 9 units, and along with that, they also have so much to do as part of the practicals. Um, but anyways, what you have in these 4 units of yours is first of all an introduction to evolution, that big question on the origin of life. And I'm sure you've already studied a lot on the evidences of evolution, the fossil records, and the embryological evidences, etc., biogeography. You must be very well aware of that. And your second unit is again the very interesting aspect of the theories of evolution, Lamarckism, Darwinism, Neo Darwinism. Your third unit is about population genetics, which is what we are going to talk about in these lectures that I will be taking with you. Shortly, I will be explaining also to you what is population genetics, but on let us first see what all is there in this unit. Well, there is Hardy-Weinberg law, which makes a lot of sense of population genetics, of why all this mathematics you have to study as part of paper on evolutionary biology. You have all studied genetics and you have all studied evolution, but this is one place where genetics and evolution amalgamate. So, as part of this, first we will be looking at the Hardy-Weinberg law, which is a law that depends on a lot of assumptions. This law was given by two mathematicians, very interestingly, and this law saved the life of Gregor John Mendel much after he had died. So, as you know, after he had proposed his laws of inheritance and much after his experiments on peas had been brought to the knowledge of the public, there was some speculation as to why what Mendel proposes is not happening in nature. So, like if he proposes that the dominant alleles and the recessive alleles should remain in the same proportion and there's no mixing of characters, that is the law of segregation, then why don't we see that happening in nature? Why don't we see the dominant characters in the phenotype perpetuating? So, these were some doubts that were cast upon Mendel's laws. Um, and of course, Mendel was not there at that time to defend himself. But the Hardy-Weinberg law, these two mathematicians, uh, Godfrey Hartfield, Godfrey Harold Hardy and Weinberg, they worked independently of each other, but then together they arrived at the same conclusion, and they validated Mendel's laws, and they did it with the help of mathematics. So, which is why in this unit you will be required to look at a lot of mathematics. And then we will be looking at some of the mechanisms of evolution, which are also the assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg law. As you know what is mutation, you know what is selection, natural selection, the forces of natural selection, its types, its modes, the stabilizing, directional, disruptive, and then sexual selection, kinship selection is very interesting, adaptation and extinction, and then you will also learn uh, how to uh, calculate the selection coefficient, and you will be learning about drift and migration. The objectives of this unit on population genetics is very broadly, as you can see, to learn the mechanisms of evolution. They should be on your fingertips: mutation, selection, migration, drift. They should all be on your fingertips. These are the mechanisms of evolution. Because, as you know, in the previous unit, you have been looking at the theories of evolution. How Lamarck proposes that evolution has taken place, how Darwin proposes that evolution has taken place. And you have looked at the evidences that prove that yes, it has taken place, that species have evolved from each other, that there were lower species and now there are higher species and they have emerged from one another. What we look at in mechanisms is how this evolution has taken place. Um, it depends heavily on natural selection and how this selection takes place, on characters, on variations. It depends heavily on mutations, which is from where variations arise, and then similarly drift and migration and selection. So mechanism is about that. And since we will be looking at the mechanisms of evolution, we will be also understanding species fitness, how a certain proportion of an allele of a gene, it helps a population to perpetuate, and then it might be giving rise to a new species. You can also be able to predict the trends in the species populations. And most importantly, as we have discussed, the assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg law and the doubts, the aspersions that were cast on Mendelian genetics, the very core of Mendelian genetics, um, how there is a difference between what the law proposes and what actually happens in nature. What the law proposes is what we infer upon the experiments either in the lab, that is controlled conditions, or in the field. What happens in nature is what we get to know with the help of empirical studies, by gathering data, by observing, by seeing cases, by analyzing them. Uh, Often there is no confluence between the two. So we will uh, look at why and how assumptions behind laws are important, and that is one of the objectives of this unit. And of course, as I said, the Mendelian laws of genetics that you would have studied in your high school, they will be validated. So, at the end of this unit, the student is expected to have a broad understanding of species populations and how they perpetuate from one generation to another. And a major outcome of this learning will be that the learners will be able to appreciate creation in the light of evolutionary mechanisms and force, And finally, the unique ecological space for all species populations will be affirmed by the learners. And along with being evolutionary biologists, it is hoped that as citizens, the learners will all become um, responsible conservation biologists, two conservation biologists who are not just governed by dogma and rhetoric, but by hardcore science, that all species have evolved together and that they have a right to exist together, and that this if this earth is kind of a ship sailing through the universe, then we have boarded it at some point of time with lakhs of other species, and we got to remain on it with those species because that is the species spectrum. They are our cohabitants. We have evolved together, and we have the right to be together, and it's our duty to maintain, that togetherness. So that was about the third unit on population genetics. The fourth unit, as you know, is on human evolution and speciation. Uh, well, speciation, that single question, um, which has, like a mystery, always challenged the minds of all philosophers and thinkers as to why there are so many different kinds of species when the cell is the singular unit of life. And if there are so many different kinds of species, then how that has happened? What has been the basis of speciation? So, in this unit, you will once again review the geological clock, the major evolutionary transition stages we will be studying from cellular to multicellular, and then the very, very interesting aspect of the origin and evolution of man. You know, uh, the cornerstone of believing in evolution is that man has evolved from lower species, and that man has these very close relatives, phylogenetic relatives, in other species groups. So, for that, in order to appreciate it, to better appreciate it, we will study the unique hominid characters, and we will contrast them with the primate characters, how amongst the primates something called humans could shape, and in how much time and how they evolved. And primate phylogeny, that will lead us up to Homo sapiens. And finally, the very, very interesting evolution of language in humans. As you know, the power to speak is a power uniquely endowed upon humans. No other species is blessed with the power to speak. They can all make noises, they all have voices. There are songs and calls with tones and notes and internotes, but nobody else can utter meaningful words, create sentences by putting words in a coherent arrangement one after another, and by communicating something, and communicating a lot of emotions and ideas. Not to say that other species do not have emotions and ideas, they do, but this kind of verbal communication. Again, not to say that other species are not able to communicate. There are many means of communication for all species. There is communication by touch, by smell, by sight, there's chemical communication, but certainly verbal communication that translates into language is something that's very, very uniquely human. So, we will be studying the evolution of language in humans, and then the product of evolution, micro and macro evolution, explained to you with the help of a very, very interesting experiment. And adoptive radiation, I'm sure you would have already been through in your previous classes. The Galapagos finches, at the Galapagos Islands, how Mr. Darwin, as a naturalist, once landed on the Galapagos, and how he simply observed the mind boggling diversity in the very closely related finches, how they had different kinds of beaks and they had different kinds of feet and sizes and shapes, and how, because of these morphological characters, they were utilizing their environment in different ways. They had different feeding habits, they had different foraging habits, how they were walking, how they were flying, which straight out of the forest they were utilizing for feeding and foraging, and how they were handling the food item. In case of insectivorous birds, how they were handling the prey item, and which story of the forest they were inhabiting. All this depended on their morphological characters, and this was the variation which he observed, and the rest is history. It was, very, very, very legendary finding amongst the Galapagos finches that he gave the theory of adoptive radiation, and this led to speciation, which Mr. Darwin says is a big, big mystery for mankind ever since we started existing, and ever since we started pondering upon the great diversity in nature around us. So, allopatric and sympatric speciation we'll be looking at. And then the phylogenetic trees. It looks a little difficult, the phylogenetic trees and the construction and the interpretation of trees. But if you know what are family trees, and if you have seen a family tree, how cousins and how marriages they expand the family tree at every generation, and how these branching outs it translates into close and distant relationships, it'll be very easy for you to be able to construct a phylogenetic tree. And this is molecular phylogenetic trees. Nowadays it's very easy. You just need some data on commonalities and on proximities, and then you enter this data, and this your computer gives you a very good cladogram, and that area of study is called cladistics. We also call it a dendrogram, and it's very easy to later on to interpret these family trees. So the outcome and objective of your unit 4 will be to review the geological clock, as I said, when we will be studying the 6 phases of evolution, and then the very interesting area of human evolution, how it so happened, and the close filial relationships with the primates, and then, as I said, language and speciation, which leads to so much of biodiversity. Now, these are the days of the coronavirus, so it'll be interesting to think that the coronavirus too is an outcome of this kind of speciation that has happened because of mutation and DNA recombination, genetic recombination that has happened between maybe a wrong pig meeting a wrong bat, and then the virus entering into humans. I mean, that is also an addition. A new strain of virus evolving is a new addition to biodiversity. It may be harmful, it may be harmful to us, but then that's how nature has been. In bats, maybe this virus has been there ever since, and it was of no harm to them in bats because it had evolved with them. But then, if you look at a new area of studies these days, which is called eco health, then you will see that at the foundation of this virus found in bats, meeting maybe a wrong pig and entering humans, is at the foundation is the fact that we have encroached too much into wilderness areas, And just like the malaria, just like the plague, this is just another zoonotic disease, and we have to find a cure to it, because it's our mistake, certainly, that we have encroached in the wilderness areas. This virus has been there ever since, but it has mutated, and now it is difficult to control it because of maybe climate change also. So yeah, imagination runs wild. So at the end of this unit, the learners will be capable of putting biological information in the perspective of evolution. And they will be able to interpret and construct phylogenetic trees, and drawing a distinction between micro and macroevolution will help them use evidence-based science of evolution in the applied fields also, if you happen to take this research for your future study. Right, so how do we go about? I have planned it this way, that today we have done the overview and introduction of these 2 units, and we will be learning about it in another 20 lectures. Some of the topics, as you can see, they are to be dealt in 2 lectures. Say, for example, when we talk about natural selection, leading on to selection and selection coefficient, it will take us a longer time. So kind of 10 lectures in both the units, and each lecture will be, I presume, more than 20-25 minutes will be too much for you, because normally when we are learning in a classroom, it's 45-50 minutes, including the attendance, which takes some time. But here we won't require that much of time, because here we are not having any interaction, any live interaction, and there are no questions and answers. I like to ask a lot of questions in the class, but I don't have the opportunity to do that here in a video lecture, so I will be doing that when we have an interaction. So that is why I have reduced the one-way monologue to just 20-25 minutes. And then a few hours after uploading each lecture, I will put up a call for questions and answers, and I'll be there to answer your questions. And that may also, I think, translate into your attendance. So that's how we will be doing population genetics and human evolution. Let me now suggest to you something about what is population genetics, to be precise, because before we meet next time for our next video lecture, I would like to leave you with some ideas on population genetics. So population genetics is an area where Mr. Mendel meets Mr. Darwin, and this is a branch of evolutionary studies where we study the differences, the variations within the population and amongst the population, that is, between the populations, because these differences are from where speciation takes place. On these differences, natural selection acts. If these differences are not there, intraspecific and interspecific, and differences within the population and differences between the population, then natural selection will have no raw material to act upon for further speciation. And this is a branch of study that integrates natural selection in Mendelian genetics, and it's the critical step for a unified theory on evolution as it works. With the help of population genetics, it will be difficult for somebody to challenge you about evolution. And believe me, there are quite a few people who will be challenging you about evolution, whether it's happened or not. And then it will help you, as I said, it will help you prove and disprove concepts. Don't be scared by the fact that it's a highly mathematical discipline. You will be thinking, I left mathematics in high school, and oh my God, I have to go through all that again. And what is mathematics doing in biology? I am a student of zoology. I like being in the lab. I like being in the field. And now what about with all this algebra? No, don't be scared at all. Uh, this branch has a heavy dependence on mathematics, but it has become very easy for you, your generation, because you are in the era of the computers. So, as I said, when I was telling you about cladograms, dendrograms, the phylogenetic trees, that you just have to enter data and the phylogenetic tree will be made by the computer. Very beautiful phylogenetic tree. Similarly, you don't need to worry much about this mathematical and computational aspect, because a lot of it is being taken care of. But having said that, I don't mean anywhere to imply that without addressing some of the mathematics involved, it will be possible for you to understand population genetics. But then it's interesting, it's easy. I'm sure you will be able to do it. So now let us look at some of the proposed books. There it is. In your course, these 4 books have been suggested. There may be many more. As you can see in this core course that the UGC has prescribed in 2015, there are so many other books. And then you have this course as DCE, and these are the books that have been prescribed for you. So first is Moody. I would like to show you, because what I have of Moody is just a photocopy. The Introduction to Evolution. It's there in your library, and some of the reading material from this book, wherever it is important, I will be posting on your group. This is Moody's Introduction to Evolution. Quite a few topics, say for example, the evolution that you see in the classification of animals, like I said, making phylogenetic trees. That's a good topic that you can read from this book. And then there is Dobzhansky, Theodosius Dobzhansky, as you can see. This is especially for your population genetics, because this is on genetics and the origin of species. So, but I'm sorry again for this book. What I have is just a photocopy, but you can take it from the library, or I'm going to post a lot of material from this book here in the group. And then this is a very interesting and a very comprehensive book on evolution that is by Dobzhansky. Strickberger. Strickberger. We already saw Dobzhansky. If you have to take a big name in the science of evolution, of course you will say Darwin, and then there is Wallace. After that, it's Strickberger. So this is a very interesting book. I would love to let you hold it and feel it, because when you will be doing microevolution, just flipping through the pages of this book will be so interesting for you. I wish I can do that sometime later for you. Very good and really very elaborate. Good to just hold it and to read it. And again, you don't have to worry much about it. I'm going to be posting a lot of reading material from these three books that I've shown you. Ayala, I'm sorry, I'm not referring to, and I couldn't get hold of this one. And of course, The Origin of Species from Charles Darwin is not in your course. It hasn't been. All right, there it is. So, this is one book that hasn't been suggested. But then, how can you study evolution without seeing this book? I know it'll be too much for you to read it back to back, but just the touch and the feel of a book that changed the course of history is something that will keep you bound to a subject that you have chosen to study. I will read from the blurb of this book. The Origin of Species is the landmark book that, for better or worse, puts science and religion at odds. Very few people who have read this book come away not believing in evolution. The detail of research is, even by today's standards, stunning, and the writing is still eminently readable, second only to the Bible in its scope of influence. This book is a pertinent book today as when it was first written. So I suggest you buy your own copy, The Origin of Species, from Amazon. You're very lucky. When I was a student, there was one old, very dilapidated copy of The Origin of Species in my library, and it was not available for being issued and being taken home. So, but then now you have reprints, and you can always order yours from Amazon at a very reasonable price. So I suggest that when you're not preparing for exams, but when you still feel hooked on to your study of evolution, go through this book. So thank you very much. We meet tomorrow for looking at one of the mechanisms of evolution. We better begin with selection. Thank you so much. Have a good day.